Truth does not come to gently free you. It tears apart what you believed untouchable, lays you bare, calls everything into question, and only then does it show you who you really are without lies. What you are about to hear is not an audiobook. It is a rupture. It does not aim to motivate you, but to awaken you. Each chapter strikes at what you have hitherto taken for granted, and once you see, you will understand why there is no turning back. Chapter 1. The Price of a Sleeping Life. From the moment you open your eyes in the morning, everything is arranged so that you keep sleeping. Even with your eyes open, going to work, answering messages, hitting the gym, you are still asleep. Not from fatigue, but from habit, from comfort, from the false belief that you are choosing for yourself, when in truth, you are merely repeating what you did yesterday. To live asleep is to drive onto a highway without ever glancing left or right. It is to rise and check your phone before you even feel your own breath. It is to gulp down breakfast when you're not hungry and rush so you won't be late, to a life you never chose yourself. You spend your days with people who question nothing, end them exhausted, feeling you have done much, yet truly lived nothing. And then you hit repeat. The price you pay is not a single blow. You pay it piece by piece. With your time, lost because you accept what does not fulfill you simply because that's how it is. With your mental energy, squandered to feign interest. With your dignity, when you say you're fine just so as not to disturb anyone. And worst of all, you pay with your identity. Each time you act from habit rather than awareness, a bit more of you disappears. Sleeping through life doesn't hurt at first. It's comfortable. You don't have to ask big questions, challenge relationships, or search for meaning. You simply follow the pre-drawn path and tell yourself that's enough. And the system loves you for it. It praises your responsibility, your perseverance, your conformity. It rewards you with likes, a steady salary, recognition. It lulls you with small rewards, so you never wonder why you still feel empty. But that inner void is no accident. It is an alarm, a silent rebellion within you. Your true self, buried under tons of shoulds and musts, is trying to jolt you awake. And the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. It shows up as an unease you cannot place, as exhaustion no amount of sleep will cure, as a groundless sadness. These are not weaknesses, they are clues. Yet when you're asleep, you mistake them for flaws. Society does not need you awake. It is not in its interest. An awakened person begins to question. He sees that many rules are senseless, that many norms are in truth chains disguised as morality. He stops being predictable, stops consuming out of fear, stops constantly seeking validation. And that makes him dangerous. Because the moment you awaken, you cease to be useful, at least to the system. Awakening is not a moment of enlightenment. It is a process. And it has nothing to do with books or sunrise meditations. It begins when you look at your own reality with brutal honesty and ask yourself, is what I do every day really mine? Or do I do it just because I don't know anything else? It begins when you stop making excuses. When you stop sugarcoating what has long since hollowed you out. When you awaken, everything becomes chaotic. What once felt safe suddenly feels wrong. What once comforted you now suffocates you. People you have talked to for years suddenly seem strange. Places you called home make you nervous. And that is frightening, because you sense that without all of it, you don't know who you really are. But that is the price of waking up. Yet the other price, the price of sleeping, is far higher. Asleep, you are alive, but you do not live. You move, but you do not advance. You develop, but without direction. And one day, when your body can no longer keep up or time runs out, you will look back and wonder exactly when you stopped being yourself. There was no single moment. It was a slow fade, comfortable, functional, unremarkable. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. You were never taught to question. You were taught to function, to work for money without knowing the purpose, to design your life according to a blueprint drawn by others, to sacrifice things that fulfill you in order to fulfill things you never wanted, and to feel guilty when you step out of line. Because what most people fear more than failure is shattering the image others have of them. To be true to yourself without explanation. But if you don't do that, you stay asleep. The world does not need more sleeping people. It needs the awakened. People who refuse to accept what destroys them inside, who are ready to trade comfort for truth, who no longer adapt merely to survive, but begin to truly live. Sleeping through life is cheap in the short term. It brings no trouble, no resistance, no change. But eventually it costs you the only thing you truly own, your time. And that never comes back. Life is not about making it safely to the grave. It is about living every moment awake, knowing what you do and why. Everything else is just noise. And in that noise, your life drowns. Chapter 2. Your beliefs do not belong to you. When you look in the mirror today and say, "This is who I am," it is worth asking where this I really comes from. Not from your innermost self, as you might believe, but from a long chain of voices, opinions, expectations, and rules you never consciously chose. Most people defend their beliefs with tooth and nail, as if they were the core of their identity. Yet hardly anyone asks how those beliefs got into their heads in the first place. And even fewer have the courage to question them when they start to feel like shackles. The truth is uncomfortable. What you think about yourself, what you consider right, what you deem normal, acceptable, or life, all of that was imprinted on you piece by piece over years, not through a loud command, but through repetition, through reward and punishment, through glances, through words, through silence. You did not learn who you are. You learned how you must be to be loved. And that is the difference that alters the foundation of your existence. It starts early. Before you can even speak, you absorb everything like a sponge. The atmosphere at home, the unspoken rules between your parents, the silent laws of your environment. You quickly grasp what works and what doesn't. When a smile follows, when rejection follows, whether you may be loud or better, stay quiet, whether emotions have space or are seen as weakness. And so you adapt, not because you want to, but because you must. Because belonging survives, while truth stands alone. Then school comes, and with it a second layer of conditioning. You are graded, compared, ordered. Creativity counts less than obedience, curiosity less than reproduction. You don't learn how to think, but what to think. And when you ask questions outside the accepted frame, you are quickly shown your place. Maybe not with words, but with glances, grades, exclusion. It doesn't take long before you understand. Conformity brings peace. Resistance brings friction. So you conform. You learn what is right, not morally, but functionally. And at some point, you truly believe it all originates with you. That this is just who you are. That you cannot draw. That you have no talent for languages. That you were never meant for great dreams. That you should swallow your anger. That tears are embarrassing. That you must stay small so as not to threaten others. Yet none of this is truth. They are survival mechanisms, remnants of moments when you sensed you had to be different in order to get by. What defines you today is often the result of what you once had to survive. And here begins the rupture that can set you free, if you are ready to endure it. For recognizing that many of your beliefs are not real feels at first like a betrayal of yourself. It is as if the ground shifts beneath your feet, because you suddenly realize you built on something that never truly belonged to you. And yes, That is terrifying. It destabilizes. It raises questions with no immediate answers. But in that uncertainty lies the possibility to choose anew, to choose freely, without pressure, without repetition. You do not have to remain who you learned to be. You may inspect what you inherited without ever testing it. You may question whether this job is really your dream, or if you're simply afraid to want something else. You may ask whether you truly love that person, or if you only love the security they provide. You may accept that you believe things that do not serve you, not because you are foolish, but because you are loyal. And perhaps the hardest realization of all, that you were not a victim of your circumstances, but their willing participant for a long time. Many live their whole lives in the shadows of conditioning and call it personality. But personality is malleable. Nothing in you is carved in stone, however much it may feel so. You may change. You may rediscover yourself, even at 40, 50, or 70. You are not static. You are a process. And that process begins the moment you stop mistaking the learned for the true. Of course, there will be voices reminding you how you used to be, saying, "You were so funny back then, so good, so diligent," as if change were a loss, as if loyalty to the past were more important than authenticity in the present. But that is the test. Whether you dare to be yourself even when others no longer understand your new self. Whether you dare to discard the lies that once made you feel safe. You owe no one an explanation. You do not have to prove anything. But you must be honest, above all with yourself. For you lose most energy not through stress or work, but by constantly suppressing your own truth. You play roles that exhaust you. You uphold beliefs only because you fear what will happen if you let them go. Yet truly, life begins where you remove the mask, not because you must, but because you cannot help yourself. If today you pause and feel something inside tightening, a part that no longer wants to stretch or cooperate, don't look away. Listen. That part is not a nuisance. It is the door, the invitation, the beginning. Your beliefs do not belong to you, but you can take them back, one by one, not to become someone new, but to finally stop being someone you never truly were. Chapter 3. The Business of Your Fear. There is an industry that never sleeps, never has enough, and never loses. It needs no factories, no machines, no raw materials. It only needs you. More precisely, your fear. The stronger your fear, the more stable the business, the easier you are to control, the more predictable your behavior. For a person gripped by fear does not think clearly, does not decide freely, and does not act from conviction, but from panic, from scarcity, from the deep need to regain control, even if it means betraying oneself. No one tells you openly, "Be afraid, that's good for us." It happens more subtly, more precisely, more cleverly. Modern fear is not a scream, not thunder, not an explosion. It is a constant whisper in the background that never lets you rest. A feeling that something is off, that something is missing, that you are not enough, that something might happen, sometime, somewhere, somehow. This feeling is not cured, it is cultivated. It is bred like a prized animal that regularly yields milk, in the form of your attention, your money, your loyalty. Fear is sold to you in 1,000 guises, as health prevention, as insurance, as news alerts, as social media alarms, as future forecasts. It comes wrapped in concerns for your career, your relationship, your body, your retirement. It dresses itself in responsibility, in rationality, in care. And you don't notice how deeply you've internalized it, because it has long since felt normal. You think you're protecting yourself. In truth, you're being manipulated, Your decisions are based not on what you want, but on what you want to avoid. And that is the real product. Not you as an individual, but your behavior as a mass. When you are afraid, you seek security. And whoever promises security, or at least pretends to, wins your consent, politically, economically, in the media. You don't vote for who inspires you, but for who offers the least risk. You don't buy what you need, but what gives you the illusion of preparedness. You invest in things that temper your insecurity without ever truly healing it. Because no one profits from your healing. A liberated person is bad for business. And yet many believe they are immune, educated enough, critical enough, enlightened enough. But fear is no sign of stupidity. It is human, and that is precisely why it is so powerful. It operates not on the level of thought, but of the nervous system. It creeps into your decisions, into your conversations, into your stance toward others. You notice it in how you react to new information, whether you stay open or instantly go on the defensive, whether you can differentiate or only see black and white, whether you have the courage to ask questions that scare you, or whether you quickly accept answers just to rid yourself of discomfort. In a world that constantly feeds you new fears, clarity is an act of resistance. Not naivete, but sovereignty. Not recklessness, but depth. But that means enduring the fact that you cannot control everything. That security is never guaranteed. That living means dancing with uncertainty, not fighting it. Yet this is hard to accept in a system that has conditioned you to demand a solution for everything. Immediately. In numbers, with guarantees, without contradiction. And so you begin to diminish yourself. You decide against dreams because they seem risky, against honest conversations because they could become uncomfortable, against change because it stirs uncertainty. You call it reason, but deep down you know it is fear. Not always loud, not always obvious, but present. And if you are completely honest, you know that many of your rational decisions were made from a place that was not free. Fear will not disappear. It is part of being human, but it must not become your internal engine, not the measure for every choice, not the silent argument you accept at the end of every consideration. For the more you give into it, the more you give yourself away. Not in one fell swoop, but bit by bit, with every missed opportunity, with every unspoken word, with every idea you bury before it ever had the chance to breathe. And perhaps therein lies the root of the exhaustion so many feel. Not in the work itself, but in the weight of having to be ready for everything at all times. Always prepared, always secured, always controlled. A life in perpetual emergency mode. No room for ease, for trust, for genuine risk. Because every step must first pass through the filter of fear, and often get stuck there. But what if you stopped treating your fear as truth? What if you observed it, not to fight it, but to understand what it tells you about yourself? For often it does not show you what is dangerous, but what truly matters to you. You are not afraid of failure. You want to make a real impact. You are not afraid of rejection. You long for authentic connection. You are not afraid of uncertainty. You want to feel alive without constantly being on guard. You cannot eradicate your fear, but you can dethrone it. It may be there, but it must not rule. And to do so, you must learn to become still, not in the sense of withdrawing, but in the sense of presence, so that you can discern between genuine intuition and an old wound, between warranted caution and a hardwired reflex. For as long as you cannot distinguish, you will react rather than act, avoid rather than create. It is a slow journey, no dramatic uprising, no heroic awakening, but a quiet saying no, every day, a little more, against the voices that want to keep you small, against the offers that seek to make you dependent, against the business built on your fear. And at some point, almost without noticing, you begin to live from a different place. Not because the world has become safer, but because you have learned to face it upright, with clear eyes and free choice. Chapter 4. The Secret Game of Power. Power rarely appears openly. It bears no sign, it does not shout, it never proclaims itself. It operates quietly, sharply, strategically. It hides where no one expects it and steers where everyone believes they decide for themselves. Whoever thinks power only resides in palaces, parliaments, or boardrooms has not understood the game. True power needs no visible position. It needs influence. Control over what others accept as reality. Over what you think, feel, question, or choose to ignore. The strongest form of power is not the one that oppresses you, but the one that makes you believe you are free while you move entirely within its boundaries. This kind of power does not use force, but consent. Agreement born of habit. Through systems so deeply embedded in daily life that you no longer see them, but accept them as normal. And therein lies its genius. It need not impose itself. It invites you to live it voluntarily. By defining what success means, how one should behave, how one should love, what one should strive for. It writes no laws. It shapes beliefs. Whoever controls the meaning of words needs no weapons. Whoever decides what counts as education, as culture, as security, or responsibility, molds reality without ever showing a face. Power has no fixed center. It disperses, disguises itself, changes its form. Sometimes it is an algorithm that determines what you see and what you don't. Sometimes it is a cultural norm that compels you to self-censor. Sometimes it lies in a friendly piece of advice, in a seemingly harmless statistic, in a moral outrage that silences you without a single argument. And if you don't look closely, you end up defending what keeps you small, in the name of decency, reason, or solidarity. To see through the game of power, you must learn to read quietly, between the lines, in what is unsaid, in what is repeated until no one questions it anymore. For power never defends itself head-on. It simply shifts the focus. It creates distraction, outrage, fabricated conflicts. It occupies the stage while the real decisions are made behind the scenes. And it relies on the fact that the majority would rather follow emotions than understand context. The average person believes they are informed because they have access to infinite information. But information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not clarity. As long as you merely consume without penetrating, you remain a pawn. You react instead of seeing through. You get outraged instead of understanding, and you go around in circles while others have long since moved on. Not because they are better, but because they know the playing field and how to enter it without being used. There are circles where decisions are made, not spoken. Not democratically, but strategically. Not loudly, but bindingly. Those who sit there think in decades, not elections. In impact, not sympathy. In resources, power axes, psychological control, not ideology. And while the world is busy with outrage, with trends, with spectacle, these circles secure what counts. Control over narratives, access to data, steering of behavior. Yet power itself is not inherently evil. It is, like any force, neutral. What matters is how it is used, by whom, and for what purpose. What is dangerous is not power's existence, but its invisibility. The fact that it is rarely questioned, that it is mistaken for authority, intelligence, or success, and that we have learned to shrink ourselves rather than recognize it with confidence. For you participate every day, not because you consciously choose, but because you have accepted the field without noticing you are already part of a strategy that is not yours. You consume because it is comfortable. You conform because it works. You stay silent because it is too risky. And that is exactly what the system relies on. Your silence, your hesitation, your silent consent. Not out of malice, but out of pragmatism. The only way to avoid being at the mercy of the game is to recognize it, not with anger, but with clarity, not with blame, but with responsibility. Whoever knows how manipulation works is harder to control. Whoever understands how opinion is shaped can create distance. Whoever sees the patterns no longer needs to play along to belong. They can find their own paths and consciously choose when to cooperate and when not. You will never stand completely outside the game, but you can learn not to wander through it blindly. You can see where you are externally controlled, where you react automatically, where you hold back your voice out of comfort. And then, slowly, consistently, you begin to move differently. Not against everything, but not for everything either. You stop merely functioning, and you begin to choose your impact deliberately. For the greatest mistake is believing you have no power. Every person has influence. The only question is, will you relinquish it or wield it consciously? Chapter 5. The Thieves of Your Time. Time is the only thing that truly belongs to you, and at the same time the first thing you hand over without resistance. Not because you want to, but because you don't notice it being taken. Not by force, not by a sudden raid, but by everyday routines, habits, mechanisms that look harmless, yet exact a price you only recognize when you have already lost too much. Time thieves wear no masks. They disguise themselves as necessity, as entertainment, as duty, or as connection to the world. But what they steal, you never get back. You wake up, and before you can gather your thoughts, a screen has already sucked in your attention. A message, a notification, a comment. Scarcely a minute passes before you are no longer with yourself. Your mind jumps. Your energy follows. And what begins as a small thing triggers a chain of reactions that shadow you all day. You lose yourself before you even arrived. The modern time heist happens in microseconds. You scroll through content not your own. Laugh at things you forget seconds later. Click, read, consume, and call it a break. But what you call a break is actually another realm that binds you. Not through depth, but through duration. And while you keep yourself busy, what you actually wanted slips away. Not because you couldn't recall it, but because you repressed it under a flood of stimuli and opinions. What is sold today as freedom, access to everything, anytime, anywhere, is in truth an open arena for those who have learned to turn your time into capital. Your click is their currency, your insecurity, their tool, your boredom, their entry point. For no one profits from your being present, yet entire industries live off your absence. Time thieves live off your inattention. They work only if you have forgotten how precious your hours are. And that happens quickly, because you are tired, overwhelmed, constantly reachable. You feel you must react, perform, be present. And in that perpetual tension, distraction almost feels like relief. But in truth, it leaves you emptier, not freer. You do not grow calmer, only more exhausted. You often think, I did nothing, yet the day is gone. And therein lies the tragedy. For you did do something. You gave your time away. Not actively, not consciously, but through incessant yielding, through looking away, through endless postponement. Later, when it's quieter. Later, when you're more motivated. Later, when you feel more like it. But that later never comes, because your today is replanned every single day by things you didn't even choose. A calendar full of appointments says nothing about a fulfilled life. A packed workday says nothing about meaning. A stored trove of photos, messages, files says nothing about connection. All of that can exist, and yet you can feel your days slipping away. Because you're busy but not present. Because you react but do not decide. Because you're externally driven, yet feel you choose everything yourself. But the most dangerous time thief is not technology, not your boss, not society. It is your own inner autopilot. The part of you that says yes when you feel no. That postpones instead of enduring. That wants to control everything rather than devote itself to what truly matters and is therefore truly risky. For what matters can hurt you, and so you often choose what keeps you occupied, but never touched, because it feels safer. You spend hours on things that numb you and call it everyday life. You sacrifice your best energy on people who do not see you and call it duty. You push the things that fulfill you to the margins of your week and call it adulthood. Yet if you are honest, you know that this isn't enough. Not in the long run. For in the end, no checklists matter. What matters is whether you showed up in your day, whether you left marks within yourself, not in the system. And perhaps reclaiming your time doesn't begin with grand decisions, but with a simple moment of clarity. The moment you realize that your day isn't empty because too little happened, but because too little of meaning did. The moment you allow yourself to stop, not forever, but right now. To choose anew, to ask yourself to whom or what you will give your next hour, and whether it is worth it. For every hour you do not live consciously is filled by someone else. And most of those who step forward have no interest in your well-being. They are interested in your repetition, in your reliability, in your conformity. They celebrate you as long as you function, and forget you the moment you pause. That is why pausing is the first act of self-empowerment. Not out of defiance, but out of dignity. You will not control everything. There will always be obligations, demands, surprises. But you can decide how you handle your time. You can learn to distinguish between important and urgent, between loud and true, between full and meaningful. And the more you practice, the less room remains for those who drain you. Time is not just money. Time is life. And life is too precious to lose to systems that have no understanding of what truly makes you. Chapter 6. The Virus of Conformity. Adaptation never starts with an order. It begins softly, casually, sometimes even lovingly. With a glance that makes you feel like you're too much. With a phrase that reminds you others are judging you. With behavior that rewards you when you shrink back. And so you begin, not because you have to, but because you want to belong, because you don't need conflict, because it's easier. You adapt. A little at first, then more and more, until one day you can't tell where you ended and everyone else's expectations began. The most dangerous part isn't the obvious suppression. It's the moment you start mistaking conformity for personality. You tell yourself you're simply calm, reasonable, adaptable. When in truth you've learned to smooth your edges, filter your opinions, compress your essence so you fit into spaces that were never built for you. And the problem isn't that you do this. The problem is that you believe it's normal. From childhood, you're conditioned to fit in. Not through force, but through habituation. You learn that agreement is rewarded. Dissent costs energy. Being different is risky. You watch others get excluded, laughed at, labeled difficult just for speaking thoughts everyone has. And you understand instinctively. If you want to belong, it's better to stay silent. And so you learn to nod inwardly while you die inwardly. And over time, you no longer feel the difference. The virus of conformity doesn't spread through arguments, but through atmosphere. It's in the air when you sense you'd better not ask uncomfortable questions. It's in conversations where everyone agrees, though each feels something different. It shows up as the exhaustion you feel after playing someone you're not all day, just to get by. And eventually you notice, you function perfectly in a world that has never really seen you. People sacrifice their uniqueness not out of weakness, but out of survival instinct. Because rejection hurts. Not abstractly, not just psychologically, but physically. You want to belong because loneliness hits you at the core. And so adaptation often begins where you were wounded, where you felt your true self was too much, too loud, too sensitive, too inconvenient. So you bent yourself. Not because you were wrong, but because you had to survive. But what you needed as a child becomes a burden in adult life. Adaptation no longer protects you, it hinders you. It stops you from taking a stand. It robs you of the ability to say no clearly. It steals your voice, which longs to speak what you think, feel, and need. And the tragic part is this. To the outside world you may seem pleasant, cooperative, easygoing. Yet inside a restlessness grows that can no longer be silenced. There comes a point when you no longer have to remind yourself to pretend, because you've internalized it so deeply that you don't even know how you feel without the mask. You go through your day, your relationships, your job. Everything runs smoothly. And still there's that quiet tug in your chest. Not because you lack anything, but because so often you weren't yourself. The true price of conformity isn't losing yourself. It's that one day you stop even searching. You stop dreaming because your dreams don't fit. You stop fighting because resistance is tiring. You stop questioning because you sense the answers wouldn't please you. And then you live a life that works, that looks stable, that you may even defend. But it isn't yours. And the longer you live it, the harder it is to find your way back. You can adapt until you no longer feel your inner fire. Until your curiosity evaporates. Until you envy those who have the courage to be uncomfortable. And then comes the moment when you ask yourself, is this still me? Or just a version of me that everyone likes but no one truly knows? Conformity rarely feels like force. Mostly it feels like reason, like harmony, like maturity. But if maturity means suppressing yourself, if harmony means swallowing your truth, if reason means sacrificing your authenticity just to avoid friction, then it's time to reclaim these words. The first step out of adaptation isn't loud. It's not a grand gesture or a rebellious break. It's the quiet questioning of patterns you haven't even noticed. It's consciously observing when you make yourself smaller than you are. It's honestly admitting that you've often said yes, even though your whole system screamed no. And it's the courage to feel again, even if it hurts. You don't have to change everything at once, but you may start by being honest. Not to please others, but to rediscover yourself. You may be uncomfortable without being ruthless, clear without being harsh. You may take up space without guilt, because the world doesn't need more people who adapt. It needs people who are real, and who guide others by simply being themselves. Not everyone will like it. Some will leave when you begin to find yourself again. But if you continue losing yourself just to disappoint no one, in the end, no one will be left who's truly there for you, not even yourself. Chapter 7. The Trap of Success. Success is one of those words that shines before you even understand it. It sounds like ambition, pride, recognition. And yet many who seemingly achieve it carry a tiredness you won't find on any resume. Because what success means isn't taught to free you to flourish. It's taught to make you strive in a direction someone else designed for you. You wake up, you fight, you give everything. And at some point you might get what you've worked so long for. The title, the apartment, the applause. And while from the outside it looks like you've made it, inside you feel a quiet unease. Not loud enough to stop you, but clear enough to make you wonder why you still don't feel settled. Not fulfilled, but somehow empty. And that's where the real trap begins. Society teaches you that success is visible. Something you can count, measure, display. Status, income, reach. And so you shape your life around numbers, symbols, proof for others. You live to prove you're worthy. That you're hardworking, disciplined, significant. But if you constantly have to prove you're enough, you don't believe it deep down. And that's why this success never lets you arrive. It works like a horizon. The closer you get, the further it moves away. You adapt to the image success promises, not because it fulfills you, but because it works. You learn how to appear. You learn the language that earns approval. You learn which behaviors get you ahead. And so you evolve not yourself but your image. You refine your packaging while you dry up inside. You learn to deliver rather than to feel. And eventually your life runs perfectly, but you no longer do. Many don't break from lack, but from false abundance. They have what they wanted, but it feels alien, because the journey changed them. Because along the way they made so many compromises they barely recognize who they once were. And the worst is, this kind of emptiness is hard to name. You can't complain. You have everything. So you stay silent. You keep functioning. You optimize yourself. You hope the feeling will follow. But it never comes, because it was never there. The trap of success lies in believing you must define it like everyone else, even though your innermost self senses that what you really seek isn't in numbers, not in titles, prizes, or others' opinions. What you seek is a state, authenticity, purpose, freedom. But as long as you see success as a reward for adaptation, the more you achieve it, the further you drift from yourself. It often starts subtly, with small, sensible choices. You take a job that gives stability but numbs you inside. You spend time with people who affirm you but don't inspire you. You post things that raise your visibility but don't reflect you, and you tell yourself that's just part of the price. But sometimes the price is so high that you end up paying with what makes you, you. What truly fulfills you cannot be measured. It's felt, not counted. It shows up in moments when you're fully yourself. In encounters that aren't strategic. In activities where you lose track of time. But because that has no currency in this world, you relegate it to hobby, balance, private life. And instead you keep investing energy in what looks good, even if it feels wrong. Success isn't wrong, but it turns toxic if it becomes your only compass. If every life decision hinges on whether it advances you, grants advantage, keeps you in the game. Because what if the game itself is the mistake? What if you don't have to win, but to step out? Not to give up, but to choose anew. Without mask, without outside approval, without fear of being irrelevant. Some call that weakness or escapism. But in truth, it takes strength to define your own success. To stop wasting energy on an image that distances you from yourself. To pursue authenticity over approval. That takes courage because you will become visible. Not as a figure, but as a human. And yes, you may please fewer people. You may face criticism. You may lose what never really belonged to you. But you will gain something no amount of money can buy. Your integrity. Your voice. Your pace. Your measure. It won't make you rich overnight, but it will make you feel alive. And that's more than most successful people can claim. Chapter 8. The role you never chose. You were born into a life that already had a script for you before you even learned to form a sentence. Your environment had decided who you should be, how you should act, what you should believe, feel, achieve, and forbid, long before you even realized you had choices. And so you accept the role. Not by conviction, but because it seems the only path to closeness, love, belonging. The role you play wasn't written by you. It emerged from looks, expectations, unspoken rules, from others' fears and longings who imposed their ideas of right and wrong on you. And because you were small, open, vulnerable, you believed it was normal. You thought you had to be that way to be loved. So you conformed. You adapted. You performed. Perhaps you became the strong one who carries everything even as you tear apart inside, or the quiet one who never disturbs or burdens anyone. Maybe you were the smart child who over-delivered on every expectation, or the rebel who had to be loud just to be seen. You became the mediator, the doer, the perfectionist, the invisible one. And you didn't recognize it as a role because you believed it was your nature. But what if much of what you call your nature is actually a survival strategy, a reaction to an environment that gave you no room simply to be, without use, function, mask? What if you learned to avoid disappointing others at the expense of your truth? What if you've made yourself small so often that you no longer know what you'd feel if no one expected anything from you? People often call that personality. In reality, it's conditioning. The role may have carried you through hard times. It protected you, gained you approval, integrated you into systems that might otherwise have rejected you. And yes, it got you far. But it won't let you arrive, because you weren't made to manage a concept of yourself. You were made to feel alive. Many live for decades in a version of themselves that works well, but feels empty. They've learned how to speak, act, seem to avoid friction. And then the moment comes, often quiet, sometimes brutal, when they realize, I'm tired of myself. Not because they hate themselves, but because they miss themselves, because they never truly met all their parts, because a part of them has lived inside, unheard, unasked what it wants, never allowed to say, that's not me. The problem is, if you live too long in a role, others come to see only that performance. They rely on your strength, your smile, your efficiency, your understanding. And if you start to change, they react with confusion, because they liked your mask, because they benefited from your functionality. And that's what makes stepping out so hard. You risk losing relationships when you begin to be yourself. But what you give up isn't real. It's the illusion of connection built on a construct. What you gain instead may be quieter, less visible, but it's honest. It's sustainable. It's yours. Because true closeness needs no role. It needs you, in your contradictions, in your authenticity, in your chaos, in your courage. Breaking free from that old role doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like loss because you relinquish an identity that gave you security. You will feel disoriented, unsure, questioning. You won't know how you're allowed to be. And that's where the real journey begins. Because you don't have to become new. You just have to stop being someone you never truly were. That takes patience. It takes honesty. And it takes the willingness to question the stories told about you so often that you began to tell them to yourself. Stories that made you small, that bound you with duty, that convinced you you had to prove yourself before you could be loved. You may let those stories go. You may write new ones. Not because you're perfect, but because you're enough. Right now, just as you are, without roles, masks, purposes. The role you never chose may have protected you, but it no longer fits. And if you're hearing this, perhaps it's because inside you already know it's time to shed it. Not to lose yourself, but to finally become yourself. Chapter 9. Language as prison. You think you speak, when in fact you repeat. Words you didn't invent, phrases you've heard countless times, terms that claim to name but actually limit. You believe you're free, yet your thinking moves along tracks laid long before you were old enough to question them. And because you grew up in this language, you don't perceive it as a system, but as nature, as air, as something simply there, functioning, accompanying you. But therein lies the danger. Language shapes not only how you express yourself, but what you can even think. If you lack a word, you often lack access to a feeling. If an emotion has no name, it remains vague, alien, ungraspable. And if you always speak about yourself and the world with the same terms, you build a mental cage you eventually mistake for reality. But it's only the sum of your words, not the depth of your experience. From childhood, you learn what you may say, what you shouldn't, which words seem harmless and which dangerous. You learn to package feelings in terms that tame them. You say, "I'm disappointed," when you're actually angry. You say, "I understand," while rebelling inside. You say, "It's fine," though your body sends other signals. And you believe you communicate, when in truth you're covering up. Not intentionally, but by conditioning. Language becomes a filter, not only between you and the world, but between you and yourself. You explain to yourself before you can feel. You analyze instead of experiencing. You categorize instead of allowing. And with every definition, you drift further from what lives inside you but defies naming. Because you've learned only what can be spoken has validity. There are experiences that elude any language, yet we still try to capture them, categorize them, explain them, because it feels safe. Because a word gives us a sense of control. But control isn't truth, and many truths are lost simply because no suitable word exists, or because the only word has been used so often it's hollow. The language you use is never neutral. It carries values, history, morality, power. It tells you what counts as sensible and what as naive, as strong or weak, as masculine, feminine, professional, problematic. And you absorb these meanings unconsciously. You begin to describe yourself according to society's labels, losing something irreplaceable, your unfiltered reality. Some words imprison, others free. But you must learn to tell the difference. You must feel when a term reduces you, traps you, separates you from what you truly want to live. When you say, "I'm someone who always has to be strong," you build a cage around yourself, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps out of protection. But each repetition reinforces the bars until you no longer question if they still fit. The greatest limitations arise not from external circumstances, but from inner narratives, and those live in your language. In the sentences you whisper to yourself each day, in the labels you use to explain yourself, in the excuses that sound logical but often mask fear. If you truly want freedom, you must not only observe the world, but your language. You must hear what you tell yourself when no one's listening. You must feel whether your words empower or paralyze you, whether they invite you to think bigger or keep you small because you're so used to it. For how you speak about yourself determines what you dare to attempt, and what you dare shapes your life. It's not about learning new vocabulary. It's about awareness of how deeply language intrudes on your experience. If you say, "I can't do it," you set a limit. If you say, "That's just who I am," you reinforce a fixed self. But when you begin to say, "I'm willing to try differently," you open space, not for perfection, but for movement. Sometimes it helps to go silent, to withdraw words, not because you have nothing to say, but because between the lines lies more truth than in rote phrases. For whoever learns to listen in silence discerns which language is genuine and which is merely noise adopted for safety, for belonging, for covering up in a world unprepared for clarity. Recognizing language as prison doesn't mean rejecting it. It means acknowledging its power and taking responsibility for what you create with it, in yourself, with others, about you. For as long as you think in a limited vocabulary, You can only unfold within those limits. But once you choose words that not only describe but open doors, you begin to free yourself. Chapter 10. Truth and system are incompatible. When you start to look closely, sooner or later you encounter a wall, not of concrete, but of structure. It doesn't seem threatening. On the contrary, it appears orderly, functional, efficient. It offers orientation, security, stability. You call it system, sometimes world, order, normality. But what you don't immediately see is this. That wall keeps not only chaos out but truth away. Not because the system is evil, but because it wasn't built to live with truth. Systems need predictability. Truth is unpredictable. It contradicts, slips away, confronts. It won't bend to structures. It questions them. It can't be tamed, cataloged, or codified. That's why it disturbs. That's why it's rarely celebrated. Instead, tolerated, ignored, ridiculed. A system can handle criticism, fluctuations, even rebellion, so long as it remains predictable. What it cannot endure is raw, unvarnished truth. You don't notice this at first. You grow up in a world that teaches you truth is the highest good, where schools supposedly enlighten, media inform, authorities act in service of truth. But once you break the surface, you discover that truth isn't rewarded. Loyalty is. And honesty is only welcome so long as it's not too inconvenient. The moment you say things that don't fit the narrative, you lose respect, recognition, access. You're labeled naive, radical, hypersensitive, problematic. Depending on how far you go, you're either ignored or actively opposed. Not because you're wrong, but because you disturb the fragile balance of a system built on collective agreement, even if that agreement rests on lies. A system functions when everyone plays along. And playing along means accepting rules even if they make no sense. Using terms even when they're twisted. Supporting decisions even when you hate them inside. You learn early that it's less about what you truly think, and more about how you say it, to whom and when. You develop a sense for what's safe to speak, and what's better left unsaid. And one day you censor your own truth before it even takes shape. That's how a system stays stable. Not by repression, but by conditioning. Not by blatant lies, but strategic half-truths. Not by fear, but by reward. Those who conform secure their place, their peace, their apparent safety. Those who stray pay a price. Not always dramatically, often subtly. One less project, one fewer glance, one fewer invitation. Enough to make you relent. Not from conviction, but exhaustion. Thus emerges a world in which everyone knows something is off, but no one speaks up. A world in which you feel yourself bending, but no longer know how or when. A world in which truth isn't missing but suppressed, not from malice but habit, from adaptation, from fear of disturbing the fragile equilibrium at risk whenever someone dares to be honest. But truth cannot be suppressed forever. It seeps through, in the form of inner unrest, in questions that won't quiet, in moments when you hear yourself lie and notice something inside you shrinking. Not dramatically, not loudly, but palpably. And there you stand, within a system that accepts you as long as you keep quiet. And you ask yourself, what is the price of this belonging? Because the longer you stay silent, the further you drift from yourself. Not because you lost something, but because you made too many compromises with what you knew. Because you nodded while your gut rebelled. Because you learned that truth is inconvenient, and you preferred comfort. But in time you realize, comfort doesn't nourish you, it only numbs you. You must choose, not whether to speak the truth, that's the easy part, but whether you're willing to live with the consequences. Whether you're ready to lose the space you carved out through conformity. Whether you can bear being misunderstood, misjudged, doubted, not for provocation, but for daring not to play by the rules. It won't be easy. You'll lose privileges and certainties. You'll have to think afresh, find new paths, craft a new language. And you'll notice how hard it is to live outside the given order. But you'll also feel your spine straighten, your gaze clear. Your choices become truer, not more efficient, but more genuine. A system will never reward you for being yourself. It rewards smoothness, efficiency, functionality. But you're not a cog, you're a human. And your value lies not in how well you fit a system, but in whether you have the courage to live your truth, even if it doesn't fit the grid. Chapter 11. The Invisible Indoctrination. When you hear the word indoctrination, many think of authoritarian regimes, propaganda with posters and marching music, blatant manipulation, crude ideology. But the most powerful form of indoctrination is the one you don't notice. The one that doesn't force itself upon you but sneaks in. The one that doesn't shout but whispers until you mistake its voice for your own. It needs no violence, only repetition, only structure, only patience. You're not forced to believe what you believe. You're guided there, quietly, systematically, in stages, so early that you don't recognize it as influence, but as the world itself. Your ideas of right and wrong, success and failure, happiness, love, identity, they all didn't arise in a vacuum. They were shown to you, lived out before you, told to you, imprinted on you, not necessarily with evil intent, but with a clear function. Because a person who thinks what is expected of them is easily managed. Not because they're weak, but because they're compliant. They don't question what everyone accepts. They don't stand up when something has always been that way. They live their life within an invisible frame they never chose. And that's exactly what makes this kind of indoctrination so dangerous. It doesn't feel foreign. It feels familiar. School is one of the first tools. Early on, you learn how to think, not how you could think. You're rewarded for reproduction, not reflection. For obedience, not curiosity. You learn that mistakes are bad. Authority isn't to be questioned. There's one right answer, and many wrong ones. And so you lose something crucial before you could ever develop it, your inner compass. Later, other forces take over. Media, advertising, algorithms. You're not forced to believe their messages. You're flooded with them until they anchor in you as if they were obvious. This is what beauty looks like. This is what success means. Here you'll find happiness. This will scare you. You think you're informing yourself. In truth, you're being conditioned. Because what you see is never neutral. It's been filtered, weighted, placed. And what you don't see isn't missing by chance. But the truly insidious happens on the level of language, images, stories. You're not taught. You're touched, emotionally. And it works so well because you don't notice how often your agreement wasn't a conscious choice, but a reflex. An echo of what you've seen, heard, consumed countless times. And so eventually, you defend positions you never thought through yourself. You repeat opinions that aren't even yours. You defend narratives that limit you. And when someone comes along who says something different, it feels like a threat. Not because what's being said is false, but because it disturbs your inner balance. Because it rattles convictions you've internalized so deeply, you confuse them with yourself. And that's why people often react to truth not with curiosity, but with defense. Because truth in a world of indoctrination feels like an intruder. The mechanism is always the same. You're not simply given information, you're given meanings. And these meanings shape your perception. What you consider normal, what you perceive as dangerous, what you condemn, what you admire. And the more often you see a particular perspective, the more it begins to work within you, not as an opinion, but as reality. Some believe they are immune. They say, "I think for myself. I won't be manipulated." But no one is untouched. It isn't about intelligence. It's about presence, about the ability to observe yourself, to notice when you say something that didn't originate in you, when you get upset by something you never examined yourself, when you defend yourself even though you don't know why. This isn't an accusation. It's a wake-up call. Because if you don't recognize how much you've been shaped, you can't recognize what truly comes from you. And if you don't know what truly comes from you, you'll lead a life that's not yours, but you won't notice. You'll fight for goals that leave you empty inside. You'll compare yourself to images that aren't real. You'll judge yourself by standards that make you sick. And the most tragic part is, you'll believe you wanted it that way. Invisible indoctrination isn't a conspiracy. It's a system effect, an interplay of interests, habit, psychology, and mass behavior. It doesn't need central control. It's enough that everyone does their part. Teachers teach the curriculum. Media broadcast what brings ratings. Companies market what sells. You click what you like, and you like what you're constantly shown. The only chance to escape this web is awareness, not distrust of everything, but clarity within. A moment of pause before you believe, before you judge, before you react. A slow return to the questions you never asked. Who benefits if I think this? Who does it serve when I behave this way? What is real? And what was only shown to me often enough? You don't have to reject everything. You don't have to fight against everything. But you must begin choosing again. Your values, your information, your language, your attitude. Not out of spite, out of dignity. Because as long as you don't decide for yourself who you are, someone else will. And they'll do it so cleverly that in the end, you'll think it was your own choice. Chapter 12. Your mind doesn't belong to you. You assume that you think, that your thoughts belong to you, that they are the product of your intelligence, your experience, your decisions. But if you pause for a moment and observe what's actually happening in your head, you'll discover something uncomfortable. Much of what you consider your inner voice was whispered to you at some point. Not intentionally, not violently, simply through repetition, through imprinting, through constant friction with a world that taught you how to be before you were ever asked who you are. The truth is inconvenient. Your mind wasn't born as an empty field for you to freely plant on. It was seeded, with concepts, with rules, with images, with stories. Your family set the first tone. School brought structure. Society drew the lines. And you learned to think, judge, and react within those lines so subtly that you didn't perceive it as a limitation. On the contrary, you mistook it for thought itself. But real thinking begins where you pause, where you don't automatically believe your thoughts but examine them, where you notice that many of your convictions were never yours, that many of your fears were programmed, not experienced, that many of your reactions are repetitions, not from maturity, but from reflex. And once you see that, you can't ignore it. You never signed a contract to adopt your mother's voice when you speak to yourself. You didn't choose that your idea of success should look like an advertisement. You never consciously agreed that your self-worth would depend on comparing yourself to others. Yet your mind absorbed all of this, because it was open, malleable, and because no one taught you to protect yourself, not against others, but against the idea that you must believe every thought you have. Your mind is not a neutral space. It's an archive. A complex network of experiences, opinions, fears, norms, expectations. And as you go through your day, this network constantly whispers to you what is right, what is safe, what is dangerous, what is embarrassing, what is too much or too little. It comments without pause. It judges, compares, calculates, worries, and you call it I. But often it's just an echo of your upbringing, your surroundings, your culture, your past. And the more unreflective your life, the more you take this echo as truth. You defend stances you never examined yourself. You pursue goals that mean nothing to you. You condemn people who remind you of something you locked away long ago. And you don't notice you're being controlled, not from outside, but by an inner system installed long before your conscious choice. Mind control sounds dramatic, almost like science fiction. But it doesn't happen through machines, brain chips, or hypnosis. It happens through language, through rituals, through ideals you never questioned. It happens where you operate automatically, without asking about the origin. And that's why it's so dangerous, because you believe you're free. The truth is, you're only free when you begin engaging with your own thinking. When you find the courage to face your inner constructs without immediately fleeing, rationalizing, or defending them. When you can say, "This thought I've adopted. It's not mine, and I don't have to follow it." This isn't an easy process. It's not a switch you flip. It's more like peeling an onion, layer by layer, until you arrive back at yourself, not the version that was adjusted, socialized, accepted, but the original part of you that can still feel without justifying, sense without immediately analyzing, live before judging. You must learn to mistrust your mind, not because it's your enemy, but because it's trained to repeat things that do you no good. You must learn to distinguish between impulse and decision, between reaction and responsibility, between inner noise and genuine intuition. And for that you need silence, presence, patience, the ability to observe yourself without immediately correcting. There will be days when you're startled by what emerges in you, thoughts that are harsh, narrow, critical. But they're not you. They're old. They belong to a system that wants to control you, not out of malice but out of habit. Because your mind loves the familiar, even if it destroys you. It'd rather suffer in the old than dare the new. And that's why it needs your will. Your conscious decision to no longer believe every thought that crosses your mind. When you say, "I'm just like this," ask yourself, who taught you to believe that? When you say, "I can't do this," ask yourself, who set that limit for you? When you shrink yourself just to belong, whose voice are you really hearing? Your mind belongs to you only when you start reclaiming it, not through control, but through awareness, through the willingness to cleanse yourself, not from thoughts, but from old patterns you held on to out of convenience. It's a process that's uncomfortable, but honest. And in that honesty lies your first piece of true freedom. Chapter 13. Who benefits from your ignorance? Ignorance is never accidental. It doesn't arise because someone simply didn't have time to get informed. It's cultivated, nourished, carefully woven into everyday life. Not through lies, but through distraction. Not through lack of information, but through an overwhelming amount of irrelevance that keeps you so busy you overlook what really matters. And while you think you're overwhelmed, you're actually just flooded, not with truth, but with noise. You're not supposed to be completely clueless. You're just supposed to be busy enough to ask the wrong questions. You should engage with things that feel important but make no real difference. You should discuss, compare, analyze, but only within a framework that hurts no one. A framework that keeps the game going. Because your ignorance is profitable, not for you, for others. It serves those who depend on you not looking too closely, not questioning how decisions that shape your life are made, not being clear about where your opinions come from, using terms without knowing who coined them, in what context, with what goal. As long as you stay in that fog, you remain controllable. not by force, but by structure. You're born into a world where much has already been decided. What's valuable, what's dangerous, what's normal. And if you never question these orders, if you never learn the background, you remain on the surface. You function, but you don't understand. And that's enough for others to push through their interests. With your silence, your consent, your blind trust. Because whoever knows nothing must believe. And belief can be shaped. Belief can be steered. It needs no proof, only repetition. It needs no arguments, only emotion. And if you never learn to distinguish between information and opinion, you'll end up passionately defending things that harm you. You become part of a game you don't know, yet every day you cast your vote, your click, your data, your labor. Ignorance is comfortable. It spares you responsibility. It lets you stay out of the picture. It allows you to say, "I didn't know." Yet in a world where knowledge is always available, not knowing is often a choice. Not conscious, but convenient. You sense it would be exhausting to look deeper, that you'd find things you don't like, that you'd have to take a stand, that you might have to act differently. So you stay on the surface, not because you can't dive in, but because you don't want to lose anything. But every piece of ignorance has a price. Not always for you immediately, but for others. For those who have no voice. For those who suffer under decisions you didn't question. For those on the margins while you say, "There's nothing we can do." And as you lean back, others step in. Not because they're smarter, but because you're not there. It's not just the big players who benefit, governments, corporations, institutions. It's also the small dynamics that settle in when no one looks closely. Inequality that masquerades as merit, exclusion sold as tradition, abuses of power hiding under responsibility. And as long as you keep your eyes shut, all this goes unchecked. Not because you affirm it, but because you do nothing to stop it. Knowledge alone isn't enough. But it's the first step. Not every detail, not every statistic, but an awareness that you always see only a slice, and that slice was curated. That no one hands you the whole truth, that you must search yourself, that you must become uncomfortable if you really want to see. Because there's no neutral system, no neutral education, no neutral information. Everything you consume carries a direction. And until you see that, you don't just absorb content, you absorb interests. And you start arguing against people you should empathize with, because you didn't notice that the same uncertainty separates you. Not the opinion itself, but the manipulation behind it. The clearer you see, the less you let yourself be used. Not because you understand everything, but because you stop swallowing everything. Because you begin asking questions, even if no one answers. Because you feel that your silence isn't protection, but an invitation. An invitation for others to speak for you, decide for you, direct you. And not everyone will like it when you break free. When you stop laughing along, stop liking everything, stop letting slogans guide you. They'll see it as arrogance, distrust, stubbornness. But in truth, it's dignity. It's the moment you begin to see yourself as an independent being, not a consumer, not a tool, but someone who wants to understand before agreeing. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to know everything. But you must stop pretending ignorance is harmless. It's not. It has consequences. For you, for others, for the world you help shape, whether you intend it or not. Because passivity is also a choice. And looking away is also a contribution. The question is, to whose benefit? Chapter 14. The true enemy is not outside. It's easy to point the finger. At politicians, the media, the bosses, the parents, the circumstances. You'll find enough out there to be angry about. Enough people to blame. enough systems to hold responsible for what's not working in your life. And yes, they all play a part. They all have influence. But if you believe they are the source of your suffering, you fall into a trap that paralyzes you. You hand over your power. Because the real enemy, the one that truly restricts you, holds you back, makes you small, doesn't live in offices, algorithms, or politics. He lives inside you, in that part of you that reminds you every day what you can't do, what you're not worth, what you'd better avoid, where you should keep quiet. He speaks softly but often, and the longer you ignore him, the more he becomes part of your identity. It's the inner critic that won't be swayed by facts, the voice that makes you doubt yourself even in success, asking if you're enough. It's the voice you absorbed without noticing, from childhood, from fear, from old wounds. And it's often more cunning than any external opponent. It knows your vulnerabilities. It knows where you're insecure. It knows how to hold you back, not by attacking, but by suggestion. Thoughts that feel like truth, though they're just repeats. As long as you don't acknowledge this enemy, you'll lose yourself in an endless external fight. You'll battle people who remind you of something inside you don't want to face. You'll get entangled in debates to avoid feeling that you're betraying yourself. You'll get lost in projections, angry, disappointed, exhausted, and eventually you'll feel empty because you weren't with yourself, but always on the run. The inner enemy doesn't just manifest as self-doubt. It lives in your excuses, in your justifications, in your tendency to undersell yourself out of fear of failure. It's the one that keeps you small, even when no one else is oppressing you. It's the one that silences you, even when you have something to say. And it's the one that makes you conform, even when your body is rebelling. You can't defeat him by fighting him. That would be another inner war. You can only expose him. Listen to him. Not to believe him, but to understand how deeply rooted he is. You must be willing to meet yourself, not in your perfect version, not in who you'd like to be, but in who you've become to survive. And that part of you, as painful as it may be, deserves your attention. Not because it's right, but because it needs to be seen before it can be released. Many try to change their life without looking at themselves. They change jobs, cities, relationships, hoping the pain will vanish with the surroundings. But the inner opponent travels with you, silent, persistent, and sooner or later you'll end up right back where you were, in a life that works, but doesn't fulfill you. Not because you were unlucky, but because you never learned to face your inner reality. The true enemy isn't outside, but he uses the outside. He exploits comments, rejection, expectations to prove you should hold back. He whispers that it's safer not to take risks, that you shouldn't ask for too much, that you're not ready. And as long as you believe him, you can support every revolution out there. You'll still never truly break free. Because liberation doesn't start with change. It starts with responsibility. With the moment you stop lying to yourself. When you admit you often sabotage yourself, that you keep yourself small. Not because you must, but because it's easier not to question the old voices inside you. It's hard to see that. It makes you vulnerable, but it also makes you authentic. You don't need a new enemy. You need courage. Courage to look. Not to shame yourself, but to finally break out of this inner prison that makes you believe you're a victim of your circumstances. You're no longer a victim, not today. You're responsible for your thoughts, for your words, for what you allow. And once you truly understand that, there's no turning back. Not everyone will accompany you when you take this step. Some people are used to the old version of you, the compliant, the functional, the quiet. But you're not here to meet expectations. You're here to grow, to unfold, to become the person you could be, if you stop fighting yourself. The true enemy isn't outside. But once you recognize him inside, honestly, clearly, radically, nobody out there will ever control you the way you once controlled yourself. Chapter 15. Tamed Spirituality. When you talk about spirituality today, you often encounter a gentle, soothing version of something that was never comfortable in its origin. You find it on postcards, in softly filtered images, in palatable quotes placed between two ads. It's a spirituality that calms instead of jolting, that caresses instead of confronting. A tamed spirituality so adapted it no longer bothers anyone. And with that, no longer truly changes anyone. This form of spirituality works well in a world that turns everything into a product. You can consume it without questioning your life. You can experience it without risking anything. You can call yourself spiritual without touching anything in you that could really become uncomfortable. And that's why it's so popular, because it keeps you occupied but never goes to the root. Real spirituality has nothing to do with incense or horoscopes. It begins where you lose the illusion that you can control anything. It begins where you're forced to question yourself, not superficially, but down to the core of your existence. It's not a comfort zone, it's a fire. And this fire burns away everything you built out of fear. Not to destroy, but to free you. But this kind of truth is hard to market. You can't wrap it up nicely, not in courses or teachings that sell easily. It requires depth, and depth sells poorly. So spirituality was neutralized, dissolved in simple language, easy promises, small rituals that cost nothing but your time, never your comfort. In this tamed form, you're told to align yourself positively, let go, be grateful. And of course, these aren't false ideas, but they become a problem when they serve as a substitute, as an excuse not to look, as a method to cover up uncomfortable feelings, as spiritual makeup for an identity that still runs on fear, just in a softer voice. It's called mindfulness, but often it's nothing more than distraction. It's called healing, but in truth it's avoidance. Because it's easier to open a meditation app than to face your own darkness. Because it's easier to repeat a mantra than to take real responsibility. Because it's easier to visualize light than to walk through your own shadow. But without that shadow work, everything else is decoration. And decoration doesn't heal. It soothes. For a moment. The core of real spirituality lies in the willingness to let yourself decay, to break yourself down, to recognize how much of what you thought was yourself was just protection, and to let go of that protection, not because you have to, but because you understand it no longer serves you. That's not pleasant. It's not easy, and that's why it's rarely said. The spirituality spreading today is adapted. Harmless, socially acceptable. It doesn't disturb, it doesn't rebel, it doesn't want to startle. Yet that's exactly what it should do. It should force you to question your decisions, your relationships, your values, your entire self-image. Because if spirituality doesn't become uncomfortable, if it doesn't push you to your limits, it remains decoration. A soothing image that prevents you from truly growing. True inner work begins where you can't sugarcoat anything, where you recognize it's not enough to believe in something bigger when you're still lying to yourself, that it's not enough to seek light if you don't acknowledge your own darkness, that it's not enough to strive for harmony if your foundation is built on avoidance. You don't need new symbols, new spiritual authorities, or another technique promising you'll finally arrive. What you need is honesty. An honesty that cuts you to the bone. One that makes you feel sick because you realize how often you betrayed yourself. Not because you're bad, but because you were tired. Because you were afraid. Because you thought you had to be someone others could love. But that's exactly where the sacred space begins. Not in the light, but in honesty. When you sit with yourself, without mask, without label, without goal, And if you can't endure that state, then you know where your work begins. Not outside, not in the cosmos, but within you. Spirituality is not an escape, it's a return to yourself. And the path there is no walk in the park. It's a dying, a rebirth, over and over. And each time you become a little clearer, truer, quieter. Not because you become better, but because you stop hiding. Chapter 16. Unlearning is harder than learning. It's easy to take in something new. You pick up a book, enroll in a course, follow a method. You sit down, listen, read, repeat. You gather terms, techniques, viewpoints. It feels like growth. It feels active, purposeful, powerful. Yet most of what you learn remains superficial until you also find the courage to let go of the old, what you carry unconsciously, what has long become part of you without ever being questioned. And that is the difference. Learning is movement outward. Unlearning is dismantling, an inner construction site that forces you to examine everything you've based your thinking, feeling, and acting on. Unlearning hurts. Not because you lose something you truly need, but because you recognize how tightly you clung to what no longer serves you. You're confronted with your old beliefs, your pride, your identity, not just in theory, but in concrete reality. At the moment, you notice a part of your personality was merely scaffolding that gave you stability, not because it was true, but because it was all you knew. You didn't just learn how to calculate, speak, or move through the world. You learned what you are, what you're allowed, what you're worth, who you have to be so others don't reject you. You adopted patterns meant to protect you, reactions that kept control over what happened around you, roles you played so often you no longer distinguish them from yourself. And when you begin to unlearn, everything wobbles. Not because you're weak, but because you're starting to become real. It's a quiet process, no loud upheaval, no dramatic entrance. It starts with inner resistance against yourself. You say something and, as you say it, sense you no longer believe it. You act in ways that are familiar but no longer authentic. You react automatically, and suddenly you realize how old this pattern is, how often you've repeated it, how deeply you've internalized it, and how little it fits you today. That's the moment unlearning begins. Not on the outside, not by setting new goals, but when you pause and for the first time, honestly tell yourself, I picked this up long ago, but it's no longer part of me. It was necessary. It was useful. Maybe it even saved me. But now it must go. Unlearning takes courage because there's no immediate replacement. You let go before you know what comes next. You give up stability before new clarity appears. You step into an in-between space that can feel empty, uncertain, uncomfortable, sometimes almost threatening. But that is precisely the space where real change happens. Not in fullness, but in the gap. You'll discover how deeply you're rooted in stories you never wrote, in expectations that are long outdated, in ideals you adopted to avoid exclusion. Suddenly the challenge isn't the new, but the old that won't let go, because you carried it inside you, defended it, because it gave you an identity. You'll hit boundaries you thought were natural, but are just old lessons. You'll face people who want to keep you in your old version because they fear change themselves. You'll waver inside because you can no longer rely on what used to be taken for granted. And in that lies the opportunity. You reconnect with the ability to redefine yourself, not out of defiance, but out of awareness. Unlearning isn't a process of devaluation. It's an act of dignity. You acknowledge you're evolving, that you're no longer willing to believe what keeps you small, that you no longer want to live on autopilot just because it works. You give yourself permission to honor your past without continuing to submit to it. Sometimes that means unlearning what you were taught to function, to prove yourself, to adapt, to stay silent when uncertain, to be someone before you're worthy of being heard. These convictions run deep, but they aren't true. They were handed to you, and you can hand them back, not out of anger, but out of clarity. When you're ready to unlearn, you won't be left empty. You'll be free. Free to question, free to decide, free to rediscover yourself, not because you have to, but because you can. And that freedom brings responsibility. You can no longer hide behind, "That's just who I am," because you know much of who you were was just a construct. And now you choose whether to hold on or let go. Unlearning isn't a loss. It's a transition, one that isn't easy, but is honest. And everything honest brings you closer to who you truly are when you stop having to be someone else. Chapter 17. Self-exploitation in the guise of discipline. Discipline sounds tempting. The vigilant awareness that drives you when motivation fades. The backbone when no loud voice pushes you forward. Yet discipline can also become a mask, a prison. When sticking with it doesn't emerge from self-care but from the pressure to constantly perform, discipline turns into self-exploitation, quietly, so casually that you barely notice how you give yourself away inch by inch. Your day starts before sunrise because you want to be productive. Your break schedule is down to the minute so you don't waste a second. Inspiration becomes just another checkbox on your list. You function, optimize, analyze yourself, day after day, so efficiently that no one sees what you sacrifice. Your body, your emotions, your connection to yourself. As long as you keep going, as long as you produce. You sense that something's off, but you ignore the emptiness inside. You tell yourself, "This is normal. It's part of the deal." You call your self-exploitation consistent goal pursuit, justify your exhaustion as a necessary sacrifice to arrive somewhere later. But the strange thing is, that arrival never comes. Discipline becomes an endless loop because it has no goal that's truly yours. Behind this mechanical drive lies something other than self-awareness. Fear. Fear of not being enough, of not being seen, of falling behind. The fear runs so deep you no longer feel it, only its symptoms. You rely on your performance level because you don't dare face yourself without a benchmark, without results, without validation. And so you become your own harshest boss, your strictest judge. Discipline no longer serves you, but the expectations you adopted, spoken or unspoken. Effort shines. Hard work earns admiration. Demonstrated commitment brings respect, at least on the surface. So you keep investing. You miss moments with people because you're busy with your business, your project, your self-optimization. You let friendships rust because you must stay efficient. You postpone feeling what arises because you've grown accustomed to your discipline. While you do all that, you think you're growing, but you're missing life itself. Discipline without self-love is a tool against you. It keeps you going even when your body and mind would scream to stop. It helps you push forward, but at what cost? If you wake early for a head start yet feel absent every evening, it's not your fault. It's the framework in which discipline became demand instead of choice. Perhaps you recognize yourself in this struggle, in the attempt to define yourself through achievement, in the belief that you must always improve to be worthy. But what you lack isn't better results. It's permission to stand still sometimes, to feel without judging, without pressure, without criteria. True strength arises not in more, but in enough. Not in constant doing, but in mindful being. When you allow yourself a light day, when you feel without evaluating and realize you're valuable, even when you accomplish nothing, discipline loses its destructive power when it's born of love, not fear. You're not average. You're not a machine. You're a human being with needs, with breaks, with bursts of energy. Discipline shouldn't remind you of your shortcomings. It should support you. When it's caring, not demanding. When it feels like an embrace, not a burden. when it helps you shape your life, not bind your life to form. Discipline isn't an enemy tool, but it becomes dangerous when you elevate it above yourself, when it tells you you're never enough, no matter how much you achieve, when it makes you justify your suffering because it was for something, when it convinces you that only performance can protect you from rejection. Then discipline isn't a virtue, but a mask that keeps your fear alive. If you're ready to be yourself, not just a productivity version of yourself, you must redefine discipline. Because it either lifts you or crushes you, gives you wings or binds you. You choose which story you want to live. When discipline embraces you, you grow. When it tightens its grip, you erode. Sometimes the strongest act of discipline is to pause, right when no one understands why you suddenly stop. Because you have no choice. Because you feel, not analyze. Because you live, not perform. And then you start redefining yourself, not as a machine, but as a human. Chapter 18. Trauma as a Program. Trauma is not just an event that happens, but code you carry inside. A program learned to protect, to save you when you needed it most, when your world was fragile. But trauma doesn't forget. It writes itself into your cells, your thoughts, your reactions, and stays active long after the danger has passed. You feel it in situations that aren't dangerous but trigger alarm in you. Your heart races, your throat tightens, your mind spins. Not because the outside world demands it, but because the old program runs in the background, thinking it must warn you. In seconds that hit like a blow, you're thrust back to where something broke. And although the circumstances are different, you react as if they still match, because the program recognizes, not distinguishes, the sense of powerlessness when your voice is raised, the trembling inside when criticism comes, the withdrawal when intimacy appears. These are codes that once made sense, kept you from pain. But today, they feel like fragments of a world you left behind. Yet you haven't really left. Your thoughts still run on tracks you didn't lay yourself. Trauma isn't your fault, but it's your responsibility. You carry it like an inheritance linking you to a version of what happened. If you don't recognize it, you stay programmed, reacting reflexively, without bringing your body, heart, or mind along. The result is a life you don't steer, one that steers you from within. It's as if you sat in a car at night while someone else drives. It's your face, your body, but you don't see the direction, and you react as a passenger, not a driver. Because you don't see the program, you'll blame your daily life for the problem, not the relic you haven't released. You seek solutions externally, talks, storage systems, methods, but the real obstacle sits in your core, unseen and powerful. To truly be free, you must bring trauma out of the invisible. You must recognize its mechanism, not through analysis, but through experience, with the courage to stay where your body still feels fear, even though your mind knows you're safe, where intimacy triggers pain, even though you crave it, where success tastes bitter, even though you've achieved it. And you realize you're not irrational, not broken. You're programmed. Recognizing that doesn't make you weak. It makes you powerful. It gives you responsibility. The responsibility to stop the program piece by piece, not to switch it off, but to rewrite it so that trauma doesn't command you unconsciously. This path is bumpy. Some days the old pattern drags you back. One tone, one look, one touch, and you're back in that moment. But there are days when you feel control, when you sense. That was me, I decided. Not the program, not the trauma. It's day by day, moment by moment. Progress can be barely visible, but it's palpable, quiet, yet real. You can't shut off trauma in a seminar. It takes a lifetime, practice, presence, self-compassion, The willingness to see yourself not as a failure when you slip back, but as a human growing despite injury, one who doesn't need the memory, but seeks freedom. When you rewrite the program, you begin choosing yourself, not only in good days, but also when the old code kicks in. You keep control of your inner world, not just your outer world. And you realize, true liberation isn't the end of trauma, but the end of its claim on you. Chapter 19. Awakening is uncomfortable. Awakening doesn't mean waking up and thinking, oh, everything is fine. It's not that Instagram-filtered awakening of sunrises and sparkling eyes. It's a process that begins in pain. A clear look at your own yesterday. And suddenly everything buried rises to the surface, and it terrifies you. Not because the truth is brutal, but because you slept so well for so long. Awakening throws you into a whirlpool of questions you can no longer ignore. There's the feeling of losing yourself as you discover yourself. The realization that much of what felt familiar no longer serves you. People, routines, places, beliefs you settled into. As you let go or put them to the test, you lose your footing. Awakening turns stability into instability, certainty into doubt, comfort into confrontation. Your life no longer feels perfectly planned or meticulously styled. Instead, it becomes raw, real, a process you navigate without a map. You uncover parts of yourself you never knew existed, dreams, wounds, longings, pain. And because you can't look away, you feel it, deeply, often uncomfortably. There are moments when you wish you could go back, away from the process, back into the numb illusion of calm. Awakening is anything but passive. It's an inner battle with yourself, not a leisurely stroll through the comfort of your old self-image. It's diving into depths where you must rediscover yourself. Sometimes you hit a wall and think, I can't go on. Yet that's when you know awakening is alive, because you feel movement, flow, and that's better than standing still. In this phase, you don't lose everything, but you lose the urge to keep everything. You realize growth isn't about more, but about depth. You see you don't necessarily need more. You just need to be more honest. You learn that not everything that feels smooth is real. That's why awakening often begins with discomfort, until you slowly rest within it. Sleepers cling to habits. The awakened find coherence. It's like shedding skin. First it feels cold, tight, foreign. But after a while you notice something growing beneath that truly belongs to you. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's genuine. Awakening is uncomfortable because it forces you to stand up for yourself, not in performance, but in truth. It challenges you to stretch boundaries, expand comfort zones. But it rewards you with clarity, not with affirmations or likes, but with knowing you no longer deceive yourself, that you create your life instead of copying it. This process never ends. It stays uncomfortable because every stage asks afresh. What do you really believe? Who are you protecting? Why do you stay or run? Awakening isn't a one-time event. It's every day anew, and it doesn't get easier, but it does get more real. You won't return to who you were, but you'll become yourself. Maybe that's uncomfortable. Maybe you'll be angry, sad, restless, uncertain more often. But along the way, you'll feel something you never did. That you're truly here, not just functioning. Awakening is uncomfortable, but everything else was just a long sleep. Chapter 20. Once you see, you can never look away again. Once you see, you can't pretend you don't. This seeing isn't a one-off event, but a state, a door that never fully closes. The world you perceive changes, and within that change lies your silent vow. I will no longer sleep where I see. This is not a loud act. but a quiet promise that echoes in you whenever you sense something decisive. You learn to function. You learn to adapt. But seeing prevents you from hiding behind routines, compulsive habits, familiar surroundings. Seeing exposes you to real life, uncensored, unpolished. Suddenly you feel people's age, the weight of their stories, the heaviness of unspoken words. You see shadows in their eyes where others only see smiles. And this seeing wakes you up, because you can't see without finding yourself in it all. Seeing makes you both observer and participant. You recognize thought patterns in yourself that no longer fit. You uncover wounds you covered to keep going. You feel urges you avoided because they're uncomfortable. And as you do, you change, not with fanfare, but in small shifts, tiny tipping points, in how you speak, in what you choose, in moments when you pause before acting and ask yourself, is this really me reacting here? Once you see, you won't drift off again. You won't clap just because everyone else does. You won't stay silent because it's easier. You won't go along because it's comfortable. You know what happens when people agree blindly. You know it not just in your head, but in your body. And so you start living differently, bit by bit. Not loudly, not dramatically, but resolutely. Sometimes that step brings pain, because you realize how much you ignored, how many conversations you avoided, how much intimacy you missed, how much you swallowed to stay comfortable. Seeing makes you vulnerable, but vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the source of true connection. And who do you trust more? The one who always looks strong, or the one who shows their cracks? Once you see, you become inconvenient, to yourself and to the world. You won't function without expectations anymore. You'll take responsibility, not for the grand scheme, but for real life. You'll find that taking yourself seriously makes you more demanding, of yourself, of others, of relationships, of conversations, because you can't ignore or bypass them. And you'll realize, this isn't crushing. It's liberating. Because you no longer live under the illusion that life is supposed to be comfortable. Maybe it hurts, but it's real. And in reality lies more beauty than in any polished facade. Once you see, you become a process. You never arrive. You don't say, now I know everything. You say, I'm on the path. And on that path there are no smooth roads, no fixed destinations. Only uncertainty, challenges, encounters where life is shared, not consumed. You might think, I can't do this. I can't see everything, feel everything, hold everything. But you'll also think, now I can stand again, feel again, speak again, be changed again, choose again. And then you'll know, that wasn't a glance. It was a turning point. And no matter how much you fade at times, this seeing endures. Because it wasn't a singular moment, but a state. Your state, the one that won't let you sleep again. Not because life is cruel, but because it's true. And being true means being awake, again and again, until the end. Thank you for going this far. If something has touched you, shaken you, or sparked new thinking, then it was worth it. This audiobook doesn't give you ready-made answers, but asks the right questions, the ones that won't let go of you. If you feel this journey was worthwhile, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. What comes next is just the beginning. We'll hear each other again.